Welcome back to DM Gives Inspiration. On this episode, we're going to talk about March Order and Surprise. And I don't mean an unexpected event or a gift for your players. I'm talking about being caught off guard, whether it's your players or their enemies. And if you're going to make use of the mechanic of Surprise, you need to have a March Order called out when investigating or exploring dangerous territory. By asking for a March Order, you're aware of any formation the players are in should something unexpected break out in their travels. Let's say they're making their way through a dusty old tomb. They fail to notice a secret passage that has a ghoul in it, and after walking by said secret passage, the ghoul springs forth and attacks the backline player. If you hadn't have asked for a March Order, there's going to be a little bit of a debate. There's going to be some lawyering. The tanks, the ones resistant to those sorts of attacks, will likely try to say that they were in the back in that instance. Of course they were. Or likewise, you want to have a trap activate on the frontmost party member. Who is that person? Who was out in front? On the player's end, you're asking them for tactics, to enjoy some strategy gaming. They get to decide what order the party might be attacked in should the attack come from the front. And the majority of your attacks should come from the front. We don't want to make our players paranoid. But every once in a while, you might want to attack from the back. Have a trap that delays after so many feet pass over it, and attacks the middle of the group. The players will then have to decide, do they want to keep their squishies in the back where they're vulnerable to that ghoul-like attack I mentioned earlier? Or do we sandwich our squishies between two resilient characters? And you should encourage them to make other considerations. The stereotypical D&D group has a rogue out in front, scouting, looking for traps. Your group may want to move people to the front, based on their vision types, dark vision, or if they have specialty movement abilities like rangers through certain terrain. The Fellowship in Lord of the Rings had its own March Order. Gandalf was in front, leading the way because he knew the way. But Legolas was right behind him, and we could say Legolas is a bit of a squishy, but he's got those elven eyes that can see really, really far. Comes handy later on. But right behind him is Gimli. And that would be our first tank sort of character should the front line get attacked directly. That does leave Gandalf exposed. That leaves Legolas exposed. But they're taking a chance because they're navigating their way across Middle-earth. Next comes the Hobbits, who are in the most danger, sandwiched in the middle. And then we follow up with Boromir and Aragorn, a double-stacked backline tank of sorts. Gandalf is also able to cast light, and so when they enter the Mines of Moria, they continue this March Order. So we're already countering one of the primary issues that'll come up if you spring something on your players. Who is going to be hit? The order is already declared. We know exactly, front, back, or side, who is going to be attacked. But the March Order should also provide tension, and making checks during these travels can increase tension, but we also don't want to ask for checks every 5 feet and ruin that ambiance you set up. You're looking to balance active skill checks and the passive perception, investigation, and insight scores that your players have. Declaring a March Order is an agreement of the entire group that we are on the move, that we are going from this point to a future point. They may want to get there before sundown. They may want to get there before supplies run out. They may want to get there before the cultists complete their ritual. A time limit is not required to have a March Order, but we're all in agreement that we are moving. And because of that, we are going to limit the number of skill checks that players make. And to keep things simple, most DMs allow for 1 skill check per increment of movement. They could be traveling through a vast crypt, so you have them make 1 skill check per room they enter, and then we move on. They might be making their way through the wilderness, and so you have them roll 1 skill check per hex they move on your map. They might be riding on the backs of dragons, and so they make 1 skill check every 50 miles they go. Whatever that increment may be, we are calling for a tactical choice by the players to decide what they're going to roll in that moment. And they could roll any number of skills. They might want to roll survival to look for tracks so they can avoid a wilderness encounter. They may want to roll nature so they can learn some lore about the area they're moving through. You might allow them to roll animal handling to help their animals make their way through the terrain without becoming exhausted. You might let them roll diplomacy to keep their spirits up in a spooky area. Athletics to climb to a higher vantage point. Or acrobatics as they balance across treetops, getting all elvish, looking out for trouble. But our elf player now walking on tree limbs is using their passive perception, passive investigation, and their passive insight. And these are known on the character sheets as senses. And if the players do not like their senses scores, they can choose to use their one skill check to make an active roll in that skill. So your barbarian has a bad perception. You could encourage them to use their one active roll during this period of movement to make a perception skill check. Now that D20 roll plus their perception skill replaces their passive perception for that period. And passive perceptions are very important and easy to understand. While thinking about other things, while doing other things, your players are this much aware. When an enemy wants to sneak up on a player, they have to roll a stealth check versus their passive perception. If the players have been alerted, you say there's a crumbling of rocks nearby, then they may choose to make an active skill check with perception, and you would use that score versus the stealth. Passive investigation is a little more rare, but this is basically when a player says they're moving carefully through an area looking for traps. Instead of requesting investigation roll after investigation roll for every 5 feet they move through that tunnel, you can use their passive investigation. And with all three of these passive skills, it's very important that you have them written down, somewhere you can easily reference them so you know what your players are seeing at any point in the game. And this becomes more important when it comes to investigation and insight, because you might inform a player of more than the player is requesting because of their character. The player may not know what a cave-in looks like or how to ask if there's going to be a cave-in if they would like to inspect if the rocks are loose. But the adventurer, having been on so many adventures and quests, passively would know about a cave-in possibility. And after giving a description, you might turn to that player and say, because of your passive investigation, you're aware the above rocks are loose. Likewise, you might tell a player who has an awesome passive insight right after a conversation that the NPC was lying. Maybe you pass them a note. Maybe you say it right at the table for everyone to hear. These passive skills can be easily ignored or forgotten about if you're not limiting your players' actions. If you always let players roll as many skills as they want in any scenario, there's no choice, there's no tension. Let's say the players walk into a strange village, and the elder stands up and says, "My friends, you are welcome here. You will be treated like kings and be safe for the night." Some players may want to know if the elder's lying. Some players may want to look out to see if there's an ambush. Some players may want to see if the symbol on his head matches the symbol of the cultist they've been looking for. If you just let the players roll as many skill checks as they want, there's no decision. But making them choose which skills are active in this moment and which ones they're going to let slide on passive, that's a tactical choice. That's an interesting thing for your players to deal with. But there's a give and take naturally. When you take them down to just one action, one skill check, you need to be willing to reward them by letting some of the content you've prepared pass them by. This might mean a fight or trap you prepared is entirely avoided by a good perception check or survival check, or it could be any check that you allow. You need to be willing to give them smart fights, fights that have become easier because they had the time to prepare, or because they made the right choices with their skill actions. And one of your primary mechanics for rewarding or punishing players who have performed poorly on their skill checks is surprise. Your players have made it down the tunnel with use of their passive investigations, sleight of hand rolls, and athletics. They managed to disable a cave-in trap earlier in the tunnel. This trap, with loud rocks falling, would have alerted the goblins below. And so the goblins are unaware. Their campfire is shining at the end of the tunnel. And the players decide to make stealth checks in order to catch the goblins off guard, in order to gain surprise. Now in 5th edition, it is not a surprise round. It is just surprise. Don't say surprise round, it'll lead your players astray to what actually happens during surprise. The normal goblin has a passive perception of 9. You'll see it there under skills in the senses next to dark vision. That's pretty low. Even so, every player has to beat that passive perception 9 with their stealth check. To break it down further, a single player can be surprised though their companions aren't, but that means every enemy beat their passive perception. Likewise, a single enemy can be surprised though its companions aren't, if all players' stealths beat that monster's passive perception. Worth noting that if the enemy and the players aren't being stealthy, no one's going to be surprised. But surprise in 5th edition works with initiative, and it can be a little confusing. When preparing for an ambush, all your players make stealth checks. If one player messes up their stealth check badly, they can alert all the enemies. In that case, the enemies are alerted. They cannot be surprised, though other players may have moved into hidden positions throughout the room and gained an advantage for the upcoming combat. But should every player who moved into that room succeed in their stealth checks, everyone ready in their positions, and they open fire, now you enter initiative. There is no surprise round, but those monsters that were surprised do not get their first turn. The idea here is that initiative also accounts for speed, recovery from being surprised. So everyone rolls initiative, your 3 players and the 3 goblins, and it might go player goblin, player goblin, player goblin. That first goblin does not get an action, does not get a bonus action, has no reactions. But after their turn, in that initiative order, they are no longer counting as surprised. They are now aware they are under attack. They just lost their first round because they were shocked by the attack. And that's a nice bit of storytelling. A dexterous enemy could overcome their surprise quicker and be ready for combat. But this can be really tragic if that second player in our order is a rogue who wants to have advantage on attacking that particular first goblin. That goblin, having lost their first turn, is now aware, no longer surprised, and it would not give advantage to the rogue. Now, of course, we're DMs here, and we want to ambush our players. So the rules still apply, and in short, stealth versus the passive perception of your players. Right after that, go into initiative order. Those that are surprised by the attack lose their turn in the initiative order, but no longer count as surprised for certain abilities once their turn is passed. The players are now safe from surprise for the rest of that combat. Though with our goblin example here, they have nimble escape, they could use their bonus action to hide, they can become hidden, get an advantage on their attack, but they do not surprise anybody. They cannot force a player to lose their action, their bonus action, and their reaction. In the case of camping, sleeping, players can be surprised, while other players are not. Some may have been on watch and heard the rustle in the bush. Some may be surprised because they were asleep and not making those checks. Just know that when that first attack is going to be rolled in a stealth engagement, we are now in initiative. This can be a little brutal, but that's why the march order is so important. Because initiative is important. If your fast-acting player for this stealth engagement is stuck in the back, they won't get to do anything before the goblins have been alerted. Your high-stealth rogue probably doesn't want to be back with the squishies. And when you make a brutal stealth attack on your party, you need to make sure there's no rules lawyering as to what position they're in on the board. Of course, I don't begrudge any DM who just wants to go back to a surprise round system. You succeeded as a party in your stealth checks. Everybody gets one action in any order to do what they want, and then we'll begin combat normally. But realize that's not what the monsters are balanced for. Allowing your players to have complete, full surprise rounds could mean your engagements are too easy. So imposing the modern 5th edition initiative surprise system allows you to have recovery for your monsters and still make a decent battle, even out of a tactical advantage for the players. This was a crunchy episode. We'll be getting more imaginative on episode 3 of season 6. Find the show over at kylefergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson. Support the show over at patreon.com/kylefergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith, and I'll see you next week with more DM Gives Inspiration.